The helicopter thundered over the vast expanse of the Panjwai Valley, its rotor blades cutting through the scorching Afghan air like a scythe through wheat. Below, Lieutenant Colonel Omer Lavoie peered through his tactical binoculars at the maze of mud brick compounds and irrigation ditches that would soon become his battlefield. The date was September 1st, 2006, and the Canadian commander of the 1st Battalion, Royal Canadian Regiment Battle Group, knew that tomorrow would bring the fiercest fighting his men had ever faced. Intelligence reports painted a grim picture of what lay ahead. Over 700 Taliban fighters had fortified themselves in the Panjwai and Zari districts, transforming the fertile valley into a fortress of concrete bunkers, improvised explosive devices, and carefully planned ambush sites. The enemy had chosen their ground well. This was the birthplace of the Taliban movement, a region where every farmer might be a sympathizer and every compound might hide a sniper's nest. Major General David Fraser, the Canadian general commanding NATO's Regional Command South, had been tracking the Taliban buildup for months. In the summer of 2006, David Fraser was the Canadian general in charge of NATO's Regional Command South, at a territory spanning 6 Afghan provinces surrounding the Arghandab Valley. The enemy had grown bold, establishing what intelligence officers called a mini-state within striking distance of Kandahar city itself. Something had to be done, and quickly. The operation that would unfold over the next 17 days would become known as Operation MEDUSA. It's named after the mythical Greek monster whose very gaze could turn men to stone. Operation MEDUSA took place in September 2006. It would be the largest Canadian combat operation since the Korean War. For the soldiers of the Royal Canadian Regiment, many of whom had never seen combat before, the comparison would prove eerily appropriate. Lavoie's battle group consisted of approximately 2,000 Canadian soldiers, supported by Afghan National Army units, American Special Forces, and a handful of other coalition partners. They faced an enemy that had months to prepare, an enemy that knew every irrigation ditch, every compound wall, and every escape route in the valley. The Taliban had transformed the pastoral landscape into a killing field, and they waited with the patience of hunters for their prey to arrive. The preliminary operations had already begun. Throughout late August, Canadian reconnaissance teams had probed the enemy positions, gathering intelligence and testing Taliban responses. The results were sobering. The enemy was well-armed, well-coordinated, and utterly committed to holding their ground. They had rocket-propelled grenades, heavy machine guns, and sophisticated improvised explosive devices. More importantly, they had the home field advantage in terrain that favored the defender. As the sun set over the Hindu Kush Mountains, casting long shadows across the valley floor, the Canadian soldiers made their final preparations. Were cleaned and rechecked, ammunition was distributed, and final briefings were conducted in hushed tones. Many of the young soldiers wrote letters home, not knowing if they would return to read the replies. The weight of what lay ahead pressed down upon them like the oppressive Afghan heat in the command post. Radio operators maintained constant contact with higher headquarters, while intelligence officers pored over aerial photographs and intercepted communications. The enemy was talking, and what they were saying was chilling. Taliban commanders spoke of turning the valley into a graveyard for the infidels, of fighting to the last man of martyrdom and glory. These were not idle boasts. The intelligence suggested that the Taliban had no intention of withdrawing. They meant to fight. They meant to fight hard. The stage was set for a battle that would test the Canadian military in ways it had not been tested since the Korean War. In the mud brick compounds and poppy fields of the Panjwai Valley, two forces prepared for a confrontation that would be remembered as one of the most intense combat operations in Canadian military history. Tomorrow, Operation MEDUSA would begin. Dawn broke over the Panjwai Valley on September 2nd, 2006. With the rumble of diesel engines and the whine of rotor blades, Operation MEDUSA had begun, and the Canadian forces were about to discover that their enemy was far more formidable than anyone had anticipated. The initial phase of the operation called for a coordinated advance from multiple directions, designed to squeeze the Taliban forces into a smaller and smaller area until they could be destroyed or captured. the Royal Canadian Regiment's Alpha Company, under the command of Major Matthew Sprague, moved out in the pre-dawn darkness toward the village of Pashmal. Their mission was to establish a blocking position that would prevent Taliban forces from escaping to the north. As they advanced through the maze of irrigation ditches and compound walls, the silence was broken only by the distant sound of helicopters and the occasional bark of a dog. The calm was deceptive within hours. It would be shattered by the sound of gunfire. The first contact came at 0700 hours, when a Canadian patrol triggered an improvised explosive device on the outskirts of Pashmal. The explosion echoed across the valley like thunder, and immediately the Taliban positions came alive with muzzle flashes and the distinctive crack of a K-40-7 rifles. The enemy had been waiting, and they opened fire with a ferocity that caught even the most experienced Canadian soldiers off guard. According to a report from the Special Operations Forces Research and Education Foundation, was immediately apparent. During the battle, 28 coalition soldiers were killed. 12 of them were Canadian soldiers from 1st Battalion Royal Canadian Regiment Battle Group. The casualties would mount quickly as the Canadians discovered that the Taliban had turned every compound into a fortress, every irrigation ditch into a trench, and every tree line into a sniper's nest. Lieutenant Colonel Loveloy coordinated the battle from his command post. Watching as red icons appeared on his digital map display, each one representing a Taliban position that had opened fire on his men. The enemy was not retreating as intelligence had suggested they might. Instead, they were fighting with a determination that bordered on fanaticism. Radio reports crackled with the urgent voices of company commanders calling for artillery support, medical evacuation, and reinforcements. The Canadian artillery responded with devastating effect. The 155mm howitzers of the 2nd Royal Canadian Horse Artillery pounded Taliban positions with high explosive shells, while American A-10 Warthogs dove from the sky to deliver precision strikes with their 30mm cannon. The sound of the aircraft was a welcome relief to the Canadian soldiers pinned down by enemy fire. But even with air support, the advance was slow and costly. By midday, it had become clear that the Taliban were not fighting a conventional battle. They moved through a sophisticated network of tunnels and underground passages, appearing to fire a few rounds before disappearing again. When Canadian forces would clear a compound, the Taliban would emerge from hidden positions to reoccupy it. Minutes later, it was like fighting shadows, and the psychological effect on the Canadian soldiers was profound. Major Sprague's Alpha Company found themselves in a particularly difficult position. Surrounded by Taliban fighters in a complex of mud brick buildings, they were taking casualties and running low on ammunition. The company medic, Master Corporal Paul Franklin, worked frantically to save the wounded, while enemy bullets whined overhead. Franklin would later lose both his legs to an improvised explosive device, but on this day, his skill and courage kept his comrades alive. The first day of Operation MEDUSA ended with the Canadian forces holding their positions, but at a terrible cost. 4 Canadian soldiers had been killed and numerous others wounded. The Taliban had proven that they were not the ragtag militia that some had expected, but a well-trained and highly motivated enemy force. Intelligence reports suggested that foreign fighters, possibly from Pakistan or Chechnya, were among the Taliban forces, bringing with them advanced tactics and weapons training. As darkness fell over the valley, the Canadian soldiers dug in for what they knew would be a long night. The Taliban often preferred to fight at night, using their knowledge of the terrain to mount surprise attacks. Throughout the hours of darkness, the Canadians maintained constant vigilance, knowing that the enemy was out there, watching, waiting, and planning their next move. The opening day of Operation MEDUSA had revealed the true nature of the challenge facing the Canadian forces. This would not be a quick victory, but a grinding battle of attrition against an enemy that had no intention of giving up. The storm that had been gathering for months had finally broken. The thunder of battle would echo across the Panjwai Valley for days to come. The second day of Operation MEDUSA dawned with the acrid smell of cordite and burning diesel fuel hanging in the air like a funeral shroud. The Canadian forces had spent the night under sporadic mortar fire. their positions marked by the Taliban with an accuracy that spoke of careful reconnaissance and local knowledge. As the sun climbed higher, bringing with it the promise of another day of scorching heat and deadly combat, the true horror of the Taliban's defensive preparations became apparent. Bravo Company, under the command of Major Nick Grimshaw, had been tasked with clearing the village of Bazar-e-Panjwai, a cluster of compounds that intelligence believed to be a major Taliban stronghold. As they approached the village in the early morning light, the soldiers could see that every wall had been reinforced with steel plates and sandbags. Every doorway had been blocked except for narrow firing ports, and every rooftop had been prepared as a sniper's nest. The attack began with a massive artillery barrage, designed to soften the Taliban positions before the infantry assault. The Canadian guns fired continuously for 30 minutes, hurling high explosive shells into the compound walls with thunderous impacts that shook the earth for miles around. When the barrage lifted, the infantry moved forward, expecting to find a devastated enemy. Instead, they found Taliban fighters emerging from underground bunkers, their weapons ready and their determination unshaken. The battle for Bazar-e-Panjwai became a house-to-house, room-to-room fight that tested every aspect of the Canadian soldiers' training. Master Corporal Tim McMeekin led his section through a maze of interconnected compounds, clearing each room with grenades and rifle fire. The Taliban defenders fought with suicidal courage, often detonating explosives rather than surrender, bringing down entire buildings in final acts of defiance. As the fighting intensified, the casualty reports began to mount. Operation MEDUSA, September 1st to 17th, 2006, was one of the deadliest operations in recent Canadian military history. Over the course of a single weekend, 5 Canadian soldiers would lose their lives in the brutal fighting. The wounded were evacuated under fire by the brave medics and helicopter crews who risked their lives to save others. The Taliban's defensive strategy was revealed to be far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined, of tunnels and underground passages that allowed them to move between compounds without being detected. When Canadian forces would clear a building, Taliban fighters would emerge from hidden passages to reoccupy it. The Canadians found themselves fighting the same battles over and over again, gaining ground during the day only to lose it again at night. Private Jonathan Snyder, a young soldier from Nova Scotia, found himself separated from his section during a particularly intense firefight. Alone in a compound with wounded Taliban fighters, he showed remarkable restraint and professionalism, providing medical aid to the enemy wounded while maintaining security. His actions would later earn him recognition, but at the time he was simply trying to survive in a situation that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. The heat was becoming as much of an enemy as the Taliban themselves. Temperatures soared above 40 degrees Celsius, and the Canadian soldiers, weighed down by heavy body armor and equipment, began to suffer from heat exhaustion. Water became more precious than ammunition, and the medical corps worked frantically to treat both combat casualties and heat-related injuries. The harsh Afghan sun beat down mercilessly on the valley floor, turning the battlefield into an oven. By the third day, it became clear that the Taliban were using the civilian population as human shields. Canadian forces discovered that many of the compounds contained families who had been forced to remain by the Taliban fighters. This created an impossible situation for the Canadian soldiers, who were bound by rules of engagement that required them to minimize civilian casualties while still neutralizing the enemy threat. The psychological toll of the battle was beginning to show. Young soldiers who had never seen combat were forced to make life-and-death decisions in seconds. The constant stress of being under fire, combined with the heat and the knowledge that every step might trigger an improvised explosive device, pushed many to their breaking point. Yet they continued to fight, driven by their training, their loyalty to their comrades, their commitment to the mission. Lieutenant Colonel Lavoie realized that his original plan was not working. The Taliban were not withdrawing as expected, and the Canadian forces were taking casualties at an unsustainable rate. He made the difficult decision to consolidate his forces and call for additional support. The battle for the Panjwai Valley was far from over, and it was clear that it would require everything the Canadian military could bring to bear. By September 7th, 2006, Operation MEDUSA had become a test of wills between two determined forces locked in mortal combat. The Canadian battle group had suffered significant casualties, but they had also learned valuable lessons about their enemy. The Taliban were not the disorganized militia that some had expected, but a well-trained and highly motivated force that had spent months preparing for this battle. However, the tide was about to turn. The breakthrough came when Charlie Company, under the command of Major Steve Gallagher, discovered a major Taliban command bunker complex hidden beneath a compound near the village of Pashmal. The discovery was made by pure chance when a Canadian soldier noticed that the sound of his footsteps echoed strangely in one particular courtyard. Further investigation revealed a sophisticated underground network that included ammunition storage, communications equipment, and living quarters for senior Taliban commanders. The Canadian forces called in a massive airstrike on the bunker complex, using precision-guided munitions to collapse the underground facility. The explosion was visible from miles away, sending a mushroom cloud of smoke and dust into the clear Afghan sky. Intelligence intercepts later revealed that several high-ranking Taliban commanders had been killed in the strike, including a Pakistani national who had been coordinating the defense of the valley, with their command structure disrupted. Taliban defense began to show signs of strain. Canadian forces noticed that the enemy's coordination was less effective, and their response times to Canadian movements were slower. The sophisticated defensive network that had made the first days of the battle so costly was beginning to unravel. However, the Taliban were far from defeated, and they continued to fight with the same ferocious determination that had characterized their defense from the beginning. The Canadian forces received unexpected reinforcements when elements of the 1st Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, arrived to support the battle group. These fresh troops brought with them additional firepower and, perhaps more importantly, renewed energy for the fight. The original battle group had been in continuous combat for nearly a week, and the physical and mental strain was beginning to show. Major David Quick, the newly arrived company commander, was struck by the professionalism and determination of the soldiers he met. Despite the casualties and the brutal conditions, morale remained high. The Canadian soldiers had developed a deep respect for their enemy, recognizing that they were facing skilled and determined fighters. But they had also developed an unshakable confidence in their own abilities and equipment. The tactical situation began to shift in favor of the Canadian forces when they adapted their tactics to counter the Taliban's defensive strategy. Instead of attempting to clear and hold territory, they began to focus on destroying Taliban fighting positions and eliminating enemy fighters. They used their superior firepower and mobility to their advantage, calling in airstrikes and artillery barrages on Taliban positions before moving to new areas. The Canadian artillery had proven to be particularly effective throughout the battle. The gunners of the 2nd Royal Canadian Horse Artillery had fired thousands of rounds in support of the infantry, and their accuracy had been remarkable. Taliban fighters captured later in the battle would speak with fear and respect about the Canadian artillery, describing how the shells seemed to follow them wherever they tried to hide. One of the most significant developments was the arrival of American close air support aircraft. The A-10 Warthogs and F-16 Fighting Falcons provided the Canadian forces with precision firepower that could be delivered within minutes of a request. The pilots worked closely with Canadian forward air controllers, developing a level of coordination that would prove decisive in the battles to come. The Taliban's use of improvised explosive devices had been one of their most effective tactics, but the Canadian forces had adapted to this threat as well. Combat engineers worked around the clock to clear routes and identify potential bomb sites. Their work was dangerous and painstaking, but it was essential to the success of the operation. Many of these brave soldiers would later receive decorations for their courage under fire, as the second week of Operation MEDUSA began. The Canadian forces held the initiative for the first time since the battle had started. The Taliban were still fighting, but they were on the defensive, reacting to Canadian moves rather than dictating the tempo of the battle. The tide had turned, but the fight was far from over. The morning of September 10th, 2006, brought with it a deceptive calm that would soon be shattered by the most intense fighting of Operation MEDUSA. The Canadian forces had been pressing their advantage, systematically destroying Taliban positions and eliminating enemy fighters. However, Taliban had one final card to play: a massive counterattack. Designed to throw the Canadian forces back and re-establish their control over the Panjwai Valley, the attack came at dawn. Launched from multiple directions simultaneously, Taliban fighters emerged from hidden positions throughout the valley, attacking Canadian outposts with rocket-propelled grenades, machine guns, and mortars. The coordination of the attack was impressive, suggesting that despite the loss of their command bunker, the Taliban still maintained some level of central control over their forces. Delta. The company found themselves in the epicenter of the Taliban counterattack. Positioned in a former school building that had been converted into a strongpoint, they suddenly found themselves surrounded by enemy fighters. The company commander, Major Todd Strickland, coordinated the defense while calling for artillery support and medical evacuation for his wounded soldiers. The fighting was so intense that the building's walls were riddled with bullet holes. The Canadian soldiers were forced to fight from room to room to prevent the Taliban from overrunning their position. The bravery displayed by individual Canadian soldiers during this phase of the battle was extraordinary. Corporal Anthony Bonka, a machine gunner from Ontario, held his position despite being wounded, providing covering fire that allowed his section to withdraw to safety. His actions saved the lives of his comrades, but he paid the ultimate price for his courage. Stories like his would be repeated throughout the Canadian forces during the darkest hours of the battle. The Taliban's counterattack was not limited to ground forces. They also launched a coordinated mortar and rocket attack on Canadian positions throughout the valley. The accuracy of the indirect fire suggested that the Taliban had been conducting careful reconnaissance of Canadian positions, possibly using civilians as spotters. The bombardment was intense, but relatively brief, as Canadian counter-battery fire quickly located and destroyed the enemy firing positions. As the day wore on, it became clear that the Taliban counterattack was beginning to falter. The Canadian forces had held their ground, and their superior firepower was beginning to tell. American close air support aircraft arrived on station, delivering precision strikes on Taliban concentrations. The Yasin 130 Spectre gunship was particularly effective, using its powerful cannon to devastating effect against Taliban positions. The turning point came when Echo Company, supported by elements of the Afghan National Army, launched a flanking attack on the main Taliban position. The Afghan soldiers fought with courage and determination, proving that they were capable allies in the fight against the Taliban. Their local knowledge was invaluable, as they were able to identify Taliban positions that the Canadian forces might have missed. The psychological impact of the failed counterattack on the Taliban was significant. Intelligence intercepts revealed that many Taliban fighters were beginning to question their leaders' promises of victory. Some were discussing surrender, while others were planning to withdraw from the valley. The iron discipline that had characterized the Taliban defense was beginning to crack under the pressure of continuous combat and mounting casualties. The Canadian forces pressed their advantage, launching a series of coordinated attacks designed to prevent the Taliban from regrouping. The pace of operations was relentless, with Canadian soldiers fighting around the clock to maintain the momentum. The physical and mental demands were enormous, but the soldiers understood that this was their opportunity to achieve victory. One of the most remarkable aspects of the battle was the performance of the Canadian Medical Corps. The medics and doctors worked under fire to save the lives of both Canadian and Taliban wounded. Their dedication to their Hippocratic oath was unwavering, even in the most dangerous circumstances. Many Canadian soldiers owed their lives to the skill and courage of these medical professionals. As the sun set on September 10th, the Canadian forces held control of most of the Panjwai Valley. The Taliban were still fighting, but they were clearly on the defensive. The battle that had begun as a Taliban attempt to establish a mini-state in southern Afghanistan was turning into a decisive defeat for the insurgency. However, the final victory was still days away, and the Canadian forces would need to maintain their pressure to ensure that the Taliban could not regroup and launch another counterattack. The crucible of combat had forged the Canadian soldiers into a formidable fighting force. They had learned to work together under the most difficult conditions, and they had developed an unshakable confidence in their ability to defeat any enemy. The lessons learned in the Panjwai Valley would serve them well in the battles to come. September 15th, 2006 marked the beginning of the final phase of Operation MEDUSA. The Canadian forces had spent nearly 2 weeks grinding down the Taliban defense. And now they were preparing for the coup de grace that would drive the remaining enemy fighters from the Panjwai Valley. The battle had transformed from a desperate defensive fight into a methodical offensive operation. With the Canadian forces holding all the advantages, the final Taliban stronghold was centered around the village of Spin Boldak, a complex of heavily fortified compounds that had been turned into a fortress. Intelligence reports suggested that this was where the remaining Taliban leadership had taken refuge. Along with their most fanatical fighters, the Canadian forces knew that taking this position would require everything they had learned during the previous 2 weeks of fighting. The attack was planned with meticulous care. Artillery preparation would begin before dawn, followed by close air support strikes on identified Taliban positions. The infantry assault would be conducted by all available companies, attacking from multiple directions to prevent the Taliban from concentrating their defense. Special forces teams would be inserted to cut off escape routes and capture any Taliban leaders who attempted to flee. Lieutenant Colonel Lavoie was confident in his plan, but he was also aware that the Taliban would fight with particular desperation in their final stronghold. The enemy had shown throughout the battle that they were prepared to die rather than surrender, and he expected the final phase to be the most costly. His soldiers were exhausted after nearly 2 weeks of continuous combat, but their morale remained high, and they were determined to finish what they had started. The artillery barrage began at 0400 hours, with the Canadian guns firing at their maximum rate. The bombardment was so intense that it could be heard in Kandahar city, 30 kilometers away. The Taliban positions were subjected to a continuous rain of high-explosive shells for over an hour, with the Canadian gunners firing more rounds in that single bombardment than they had fired in the previous year of training. When the barrage lifted, the infantry moved forward under cover of smoke screens and close air support. The Taliban response was immediate and fierce, with the remaining fighters opening fire from concealed positions throughout the village. However, their numbers were greatly reduced from the beginning of the battle, and their ammunition supplies were running low. The Canadian forces advanced steadily, clearing each compound with the methodical precision that had become their trademark. The fighting was still intense, but the Canadian soldiers had learned to work as a team. They moved with the confidence of professionals, covering each other's movements and communicating effectively under fire. The Taliban's resistance was fierce but increasingly desperate, with many fighters attempting suicidal attacks rather than face capture. The Canadian forces dealt with these attacks with grim efficiency, showing no mercy to an enemy that had shown none to them. By midday, the Canadian forces had secured most of the village. The remaining Taliban fighters were trapped in a small complex of buildings with no possibility of escape. Lieutenant Colonel Lavoie made the decision to offer them one final chance to surrender, not out of mercy, but out of a desire to end the battle and preserve the lives of his soldiers. The Taliban response was a burst of automatic weapons fire. The final assault was conducted by Alpha Company, supported by combat engineers and heavy weapons teams. The buildings were systematically destroyed, with the Taliban fighters fighting to the last man. When the smoke cleared, the Canadian forces had achieved complete victory. The Taliban defense of the Panjwai Valley was broken, and the remaining enemy fighters were either dead or fleeing toward the Pakistan border. The cost of victory had been high. 4 Canadian soldiers were killed and 9 others were wounded in the fighting. A further statement from the alliance said, "Reports indicate that more than 200 Taliban fighters have been killed since." Operation MEDUSA began early morning on September 9, 2006. The Canadian forces had suffered significant casualties, but they had achieved their objective. The Taliban's attempt to establish a mini-state in southern Afghanistan had been decisively defeated, as the Canadian soldiers secured the battlefield. They found evidence of the Taliban's sophisticated defensive preparations the enemy had created, an impressive network of bunkers, tunnels, and fighting positions that would have been difficult for any army to overcome. The fact that the Canadian forces had succeeded was a testament to their training, their equipment, and their determination. The victory at Spin Bolduc marked the effective end of Operation MEDUSA. The Canadian forces had achieved their objective, but at a cost that would be remembered for generations. The battle had tested the Canadian military in ways that it had not been tested since the Korean War, and the soldiers had proven themselves worthy of their predecessors who had fought at Vimy Ridge and other historic battles. September 2006 marked the official end of Operation MEDUSA. But the echoes of the battle would reverberate through the Canadian military and the broader war in Afghanistan for years to come. As the smoke cleared over the Panjwai Valley, the Canadian forces began the grim task of counting the cost of their victory. The battle had lasted 17 days, and it had fundamentally changed the nature of the war in southern Afghanistan. The immediate aftermath of the battle was characterized by a mixture of triumph and sorrow. The Canadian forces had achieved a decisive victory, breaking the Taliban's hold on their traditional stronghold and demonstrating that the insurgency could be defeated by determined and well-equipped forces. However, the victory had come at a heavy price in both Canadian and Taliban casualties. The young soldiers who had survived the battle were forever changed by their experience. The battlefield itself bore witness to the intensity of the fighting. The villages of Pashmel Bazar Panjwai, Spin Bolduc, were largely destroyed, their mud brick buildings reduced to rubble by the continuous bombardment and house-to-house fighting. The irrigation systems that had sustained the valley's agriculture for centuries were damaged, and it would take years to repair the infrastructure. The human cost was even greater, with hundreds of Taliban fighters killed and countless civilians. Displaced by the fighting, the strategic implications of Operation MEDUSA were significant. The Taliban had attempted to establish a mini-state in the Panjwai Valley, complete with their own government, courts, and military forces. The Canadian victory had demonstrated that such attempts would not be tolerated by the international community. The battle had also shown that the Taliban were not invincible, and that they could be defeated by conventional military forces when properly employed. However, the victory was not without its limitations. The subsequent failure of the NATO-ISAF International Security Assistance Force to retain control of the strategic valley after Operation MEDUSA enabled the Taliban to return in the late fall. The Canadian forces had won the battle, but they did not have sufficient troops to hold the territory permanently. Within months, Taliban fighters would begin to filter back into the valley, and the cycle of violence would begin again. The soldiers who had fought in Operation MEDUSA would carry the scars of the battle for the rest of their lives. Many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, struggling to readjust to civilian life after experiencing such intense combat. The Canadian military worked to provide support for these veterans, but the challenges were enormous. Some soldiers would never fully recover from their experiences in the Panjwai Valley. The families of the fallen soldiers faced their own struggles. The wives, children, and parents of the Canadian soldiers who had died in the battle had to cope with their loss while the war continued. The Canadian government provided support and compensation, but nothing could replace the loved ones who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Their names would be engraved on monuments and remembered in ceremonies, but their absence would be felt forever. The battle also had a significant impact on Canadian public opinion about the war in Afghanistan. The intensity of the fighting and the high casualty rate led to increased debate about Canada's role in the conflict. Some Canadians questioned whether the sacrifice was worth it, while others argued that the victory demonstrated the importance of the mission. The debate would continue for years, influencing Canadian policy in Afghanistan and beyond. For the Canadian military, Operation MEDUSA was a watershed moment. The battle had demonstrated that Canadian forces could fight and win against a determined enemy, but it had also revealed weaknesses in equipment, training, and doctrine. The lessons learned in the Panjwai Valley would be incorporated into future training programs, and equipment procurement decisions. The Canadian military emerged from the battle more experienced and more capable than it had been before. The Taliban, for their part, learned their own lessons from the defeat. They would never again attempt to hold territory in such a conventional manner, instead adapting their tactics to focus on guerrilla warfare and terrorism. The battle marked the end of the Taliban's attempts to establish a conventional mini-state, and the beginning of their evolution into a more sophisticated insurgency. Years later, veterans of Operation MEDUSA would gather to remember their fallen comrades and reflect on their experiences. They would speak of the intensity of the fighting, the bonds forged in combat, and the pride they felt in their achievement. They had answered their country's call and served with distinction in one of the most challenging battles in Canadian military history. Their sacrifice and their victory would be remembered as long as Canada's military history is told. The Panjwai Valley would remain contested territory for years to come, with Canadian and other NATO forces continuing to fight for control. The Battle of Operation MEDUSA had established a precedent. The Taliban could be defeated, and the international community was committed to ensuring that Afghanistan would not become a haven for terrorists. The victory had been costly, but it had been decisive, and it had set the stage for the long struggle that would continue for years to come. This account draws upon historical records and testimonies from Operation MEDUSA, one of the most significant battles fought by Canadian forces in Afghanistan. The valor and sacrifice of the soldiers who fought in the Panjwai Valley in September 2006 will be remembered as a defining moment in Canada's military history.